The day Mamie Winslow put a bullet through a weather-vane rooster at 400 yards, the men of Dusty Creek, Texas, gathered around the shattered iron bird and argued amongst themselves about who among them might have done it by accident. That was the summer of 1882, and Mamie had been shooting since she was old enough to lift her father's old Springfield rifle without it knocking her clean off her feet. She was 24 years old now, lean and sun-browned. With dark hair she kept braided tight against the back of her neck, and eyes the color of creek water in late afternoon. She wore practical clothes, a canvas duster that had belonged to her father, boots she'd resoled herself twice, and a hat with a brim wide enough to shade her face from the brutal West Texas sun. She was, by any objective measure, the finest shot in 3 counties. The men of those counties had spent the better part of a decade refusing to admit it. It was not for lack of evidence. In the spring of 1879, she had won the Milford County shooting competition outright, drilling 10 consecutive targets while the best male competitors managed 6 or 7. The judge, a round-faced man named Prentice who wore his authority like a second hat, had declared the results irregular and awarded the prize money to a rancher's son named Holt who had hit 8. Mamie had taken her rifle, walked home 3 miles in the dust, and said nothing to anyone. That was the way of it. Her father, Thomas Winslow, had died the previous winter of a fever that came on fast and left faster, taking him with it in 4 days flat. He had left her 40 acres of dry but workable land outside of town, the Springfield rifle, a sorrel mare named Cora, and a reputation for stubbornness that Mamie wore without apology. She had no brothers, no husband, and no interest in acquiring either simply for the sake of appearances. She had a small herd of cattle, a kitchen garden, and a coop of chickens that provided just enough to keep her fed and her taxes paid. The town of Dusty Creek sat in a fold of land between 2 low ridges in West Texas, the kind of place that appeared on maps with a period rather than a star. There was a general store run by a man named Hector Blaine and his wife Clara, a livery stable, a doctor who doubled as a barber, a saloon called the Yellow Dog, and a sheriff's office currently occupied by a man named Roy Terrell who was more bark than action. The population was somewhere around 300 souls, counting the outlying ranches, and everyone knew everyone else's business with the thoroughness of people who had very little else to entertain themselves. The trouble that summer had been building like a thunderhead. A man named Wade Garrett had been buying up land, or rather, pressuring people into selling it, with the backing of a railroad company whose surveyors had been seen riding the ridgelines in the spring. Garrett was not from Texas. He had come down from Kansas with money and lawyers and a smile that never reached his eyes, and he had already acquired 6 properties in and around Dusty Creek by methods that ranged from the merely aggressive to the outright suspicious. Old Pete Haverson, who had farmed the eastern draw for 30 years, had sold after his barn burned down under circumstances that Sheriff Terrell called undetermined. The Ruiz family, who had held land granted by the Mexican government before Texas was Texas, had been served with papers challenging the validity of their deed, and they did not have money for lawyers. Mamie's 40 acres sat squarely in the path of the proposed route, and she had received 2 visits from Garrett's men, large, quiet men in clean clothes who did not look like they had ever worked cattle, asking whether she might be interested in a reasonable offer. She had told both of them, with great politeness and perfect clarity, that she was not. It was on the 3rd visit, when one of Garrett's men arrived not with an offer but with a look in his eyes that made Cora shift and stamp in the paddock, that Mamie stepped out of her house holding the Springfield and said, equally quietly, that he had until the count of 3 to turn his horse around. He turned it around at 2. That evening, sitting on her porch watching the light leave the sky in long orange ribbons, Mamie was aware that the situation was becoming something more than a nuisance. She was one woman on 40 acres, and even the best shot in 3 counties could not watch all 4 directions at once. She was not afraid. Exactly, fear had never been a thing that sat comfortably in her chest, but she was thinking hard and methodically about what the next moves on the board might be. It was the following Tuesday when Samuel Covington rode into Dusty Creek, and Mamie first laid eyes on him from the doorway of Hector Blaine's general store. She saw a man on a gray horse, which was the first thing. The horse was well kept and moved with the fluid ease of an animal that trusted its rider, and Mamie always noticed horses before she noticed men. The man himself was somewhere around 30, broad through the shoulders, wearing a duster that had seen genuine work and a hat that was battered in a way that suggested weather rather than affectation. He had a Winchester rifle in the saddle scabbard and a Colt on his hip, and he carried himself with the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have learned to be efficient because wasted effort has consequences. He stopped his horse in front of the sheriff's office and went inside without looking around in the way that newcomers usually did, as if he already knew where everything was or simply didn't require the orientation. "Who is that?" Mamie asked Clara Blaine, who was arranging bolts of calico on the counter behind her. "Covington," Clara said, with the confidence of a woman who made it her business to know. "Samuel Covington. He rode through here about 4 years back, I think. Used to work for the Cattlemen's Association. There's talk that Roy Terrell sent for him." "What kind of talk?" "The kind that says Roy Terrell is in over his head and knows it." Clara smoothed a bolt of yellow cotton. "Is the kind of talk that's been accurate for some time." Mamie bought her flour and her cartridges and went back to her horse, and she might have thought no more about Samuel Covington that day, except that as she was loading her saddlebags, he came out of the sheriff's office, and their eyes met across the 12 feet of packed dust between them. He looked at her with a directness that was not rude, but was entirely without the particular brand of dismissiveness she had grown accustomed to from men in Dusty Creek. It was simply a look, one adult taking the measure of another, and it lasted only a moment before he touched the brim of his hat and turned toward the livery stable with his horse. Mamie rode home and thought about her cattle and her land and Wade Garrett's clean-clothed men, and only somewhat about the gray horse and its rider. She learned more about Samuel Covington over the following week in the natural way that information spread in Dusty Creek, which was through Clara Blaine, who learned it from the livery stable man, who talked to the sheriff, who talked to everyone. Covington had indeed been employed by the Texas and Southwestern Cattlemen's Association as an investigator of sorts, a man sent into disputed territories to assess situations and report back, and sometimes to do more than report. He had a reputation for thoroughness and for keeping his word, which were two things Mamie considered the most important characteristics a person could have. He had come to Dusty Creek because Roy Terrell had written to the association describing the situation with Wade Garrett, and the association, which had its own concerns about railroad land acquisition disrupting cattle routes, had sent Covington to look into it. He was staying at the Blaine house, which had a spare room Clara rented out, and he had been seen asking careful questions around town in a way that was thorough without being intrusive. He had visited the Ruiz family. He had ridden out to look at what remained of Pete Haverson's barn. He had spent a long afternoon at the courthouse in the county seat reviewing land records. On the 8th day after his arrival, he rode out to Mamie's place. She saw him coming from a quarter-mile off, which was one of the advantages of flat country and a clear day, and she set down the fence post she had been working on and wiped her hands on her canvas pants and waited. She was not the kind of woman who ran inside to arrange her hair when a man came calling, and she was not starting now. He pulled up at the fence line and stopped there, which she respected. He didn't ride onto her property uninvited. "Miss Winslow," he said, "I'm Samuel Covington. I've been sent by the Cattlemen's Association to look into the land situation here. I was wondering if I might speak with you about the approaches you've received from Wade Garrett's people." "You can come in," she said, and opened the gate. She made coffee on the iron stove, real coffee, not the chicory substitute that was increasingly common, and they sat at the table she had made with her own hands from boards salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding, and she told him plainly what had happened. Both visits, what the men had said, what she had said, and the third visit with the look in the man's eyes that had made her bring out the Springfield. Covington listened without interrupting, which was another thing she appreciated. He had a way of listening that communicated genuine attention, rather than the patience of a man waiting for his turn to speak. "When you brought out the rifle," he said when she finished, "did he say anything before he left? He said he would be back with a better offer. Did he indicate what a better offer might look like?" "He did not." Covington nodded, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. "Garrett's been doing this across 4 counties. He has legal cover for most of it, the lawyers are good, but the methods outside the law have been consistent enough that the pattern is clear. The association is interested in stopping him, because 3 of the proposed routes cut across established cattle drives. Your situation is one piece of a larger picture." "I appreciate you telling me the larger picture," Mamie said. "Most men who come out here telling me about my situation leave out the parts that suggest I'm capable of understanding them." He looked at her with that same direct, unadorned attention. "I can see that would be frustrating." "It is," she said simply. He finished his coffee and stood to leave, and at the door he paused and turned back. "Miss Winslow, how long have you been working this land alone?" 8 months, she said, "since my father died." He nodded once, something shifting briefly in his expression, not pity, which she would have resented, but something closer to acknowledgement. "I'll be in touch," he said, and went out to his horse. She watched him ride away and then went back to her fence post, and she found herself thinking that he was a man who used words the way she used ammunition, only when she had a clear shot and a good reason. The following Saturday was the occasion of Dusty Creek's summer fair, a modest affair involving a roping competition, a pie contest judged by Pastor Hughes with suspicious enthusiasm, and what passed for a shooting exhibition. The shooting exhibition was, in Mamie's experience, the part of the fair most calculated to irritate her. It had been organized for the past 6 years by a man named Calhoun Briggs, who owned the largest ranch in the county, and considered himself something of an authority on marksmanship, because he had once shot a rattlesnake off a fence post from 30 feet away. The exhibition was always won by Briggs himself or one of his ranch hands, and the targets were set at distances and conditions that suited them, and the whole thing was managed with the casual exclusion of anyone who might disturb the established order. Mamie came to the fair because Clara Blaine expected it, and because she had entered her apple preserves in the food competition and intended to see whether they placed, which they did second, behind Alina Ruiz's pepper jelly, which was genuinely excellent and deserved first. She watched the roping with professional interest and ate a piece of peach pie, and spoke to various people about the weather and the state of the grass, and all the other topics that carried the weight of real anxiety in this part of Texas in this era. And then she drifted toward the shooting exhibition because she could not entirely help herself. The targets were tin cans and painted boards set at ranges between 50 and 200 yards, and the 6 men competing were hitting them with varying degrees of success. Briggs was doing well at the closer targets and poorly at the farther ones, which he compensated for by standing straighter and gripping his rifle more aggressively, as if the rifle were to blame for the distance. Mamie stood at the edge of the gathered crowd and watched and did not say anything. Samuel Covington was there too. She noticed standing somewhat apart from the main crowd, watching the exhibition with the same focused attention he seemed to bring to everything. After a moment she saw him look toward her, and something passed between them that might have been shared amusement or simply shared observation. Briggs finished his round to general applause and took a small bow and said something about how the key to good shooting was a steady nerve and strong character, at which Mamie's jaw tightened briefly. "You could beat every man here," said a voice at her shoulder, and she turned to find Clara Blaine standing there with a knowing expression. "I know that," Mamie said. The problem is that knowing it and them knowing it are two different things, Clara said. I've been aware of that for some time. It was at this point that Samuel Covington walked over. He had the Winchester from his saddle scabbard with him, carrying it easily at his side, and he looked between Mamie and Clara with that steady expression before his gaze settled on Mamie. "Miss Winslow," he said, "I've heard it said around town that you're a considerable shot." "It's been said," she agreed. "I've also heard it said by several of the men here that it's been exaggerated." He said this without inflection, as simple fact. That the results people have seen were luck or trick or some other explanation that removes the skill from the equation. "Also accurate," she said, watching him. And then he did something she did not expect. He held out the Winchester to her, not offering it as a gift, not with condescension, not with the particular performance of a man proving something to himself. He held it out with the matter-of-fact directness of a man making a reasonable practical suggestion, and he said, looking her straight in the eye, "Prove it to me." She looked at the rifle. She looked at him. There was no mockery in his face, no test being set by a man who expected to be surprised and then be able to explain the surprise away. There was something else in his expression, a genuine, focused curiosity, and underneath it, the faintest suggestion of respect held in reserve, waiting to be confirmed. "I have my own rifle," she said. "Then get it," he said. She went to Cora's saddlebag and retrieved the Springfield, and when she came back the crowd had noticed something was happening and had shifted in that way crowds do, without quite knowing what they were turning toward. "What's the farthest target set today?" she asked him. 200 yards, he said. She looked at the 200-yard target, a painted board the size of a dinner plate, and then past it, to where the ridge broke above the fair ground. There was a piece of fence post sticking up on the ridge line, left there from some previous work or accident, pale wood against the sky. She estimated the distance at something around 400 yards. "That post," she said. Covington looked at the post. Then he looked at her. "All right," he said. She raised the Springfield to her shoulder, took 2 full breaths to steady herself, felt the particular stillness that came over her when she was about to shoot, the world narrowing to the line between her eye and the target, the air going quiet, the rifle becoming an extension of her intention rather than a separate object, and she squeezed the trigger. The fence post exploded in a shower of white splinters. The crowd was quiet for a moment, the way a crowd goes quiet when it has witnessed something that requires a moment's reassessment of what it believed to be true. Calhoun Briggs said, "Wind must have taken that post already," and a few of the men around him made sounds of agreement. Samuel Covington looked at the ridge for a long moment, and then he looked at Mamie, and what was on his face now was not surprise. It was something much more interesting than surprise. It was the expression of a man who had suspected something, and has now had that suspicion confirmed, and who finds the confirmation genuinely satisfying. "That," he said quietly, "is the finest shot I've seen in a considerable number of years." "I know," she said. He turned to look at Briggs and the men around him. "That was 400 yards with a Springfield on an unsupported position," he said, in the same easy conversational tone he used for everything. "With wind." Briggs opened his mouth and closed it. Mamie handed the Springfield back to its carrying position and said nothing further, because she had learned long ago that saying more was unnecessary when the shot had already spoken. But she noticed, as she turned back to find Clara, that several of the younger men in the crowd were looking at her differently than they had before, not with the reflexive dismissal she was accustomed to, but with something approaching genuine reconsideration. And she noticed that Samuel Covington was still watching her, with a look that she was beginning to find difficult to categorize. They walked back toward the main fair together, not by design exactly, but because they were both moving in the same direction and neither of them turned away. For a little while they walked in companionable silence, which suited them both, and then he said, "You've been doing that your whole life. Hitting things nobody expects you to hit." "Since I was 9 years old," she said. My father believed that a person living alone in this country needed to be able to defend themselves and feed themselves at range, and that applied to me the same as it would have to a son. He sounds like he was a sensible man. The most sensible man I ever knew, she said, and felt the grief move through her in the brief, quiet way it did now, not the sharp rawness of the early months, but a steady, known ache. He would have found the reaction of this crowd very funny, the attribution of your shot to wind. He would have appreciated that particularly, she said, and found, somewhat to her surprise, that she was smiling. Covington smiled too, and it changed his face, broke the seriousness of it open into something warmer and younger, and she thought that it was not a smile he gave away easily, which made it more worth having. He bought her a piece of cornbread from the church women's table, simply because he was buying one for himself, and it would have been impolite not to offer, and they ate standing up in the shade of the livery stable's rear wall, talking about things that mattered and things that didn't in roughly equal measure. He told her he had grown up in Missouri, had come west after the war. The war between the states had ended when he was a boy of 12, but its aftermath had reshaped the country he came up in, and had spent the better part of 15 years doing work that took him from the Mexican border to the Wyoming Territory. He spoke of it without embellishment, just facts arranged in order, and she found this refreshing after years of men in Dusty Creek who told stories about themselves the way fishermen described their catches. She told him about the land, what it had taken to get 40 acres producing even marginally, what the water situation was, how the cattle market had moved over the past 3 years, what she thought about the coming fall. She talked about the land with the precision and affection of someone who has fought for something and come to love it through the fighting. "You intend to keep it," he said. "Every inch," she said. He nodded, and there was something in that nod that was more than acknowledgement of a fact. It was something closer to alignment, two people discovering that they faced the same direction. The week after the fair, the situation with Wade Garrett escalated. One of Mamie's fence lines was cut in the night 3 sections, along the east pasture, which allowed 2 of her cattle to wander and one to fall into a dry creek bed and break its leg, which meant she had to put the animal down herself. She found the cut wire in the gray early morning and stood looking at it in the cold light with her hands on her hips and something very cold and steady moving through her that was not quite anger, though it lived next door to it. She sent word to Samuel Covington through Clara Blaine, because Covington had asked her to report anything of this nature, and he arrived at her place before noon. He examined the cut wire carefully, crouching down to look at it with the systematic attention of a man building a case, and then he walked the fence line to the corner post and back again, and then he walked out into the pasture looking at the ground, and Mamie walked with him because it was her land and she saw no reason not to. 3 men, he said, reading the boot tracks in the soft dirt. They came from the Ridge Road. The cuts are clean wire nippers, not a knife. Garrett's men carry tools, she said. Consistently, he agreed. He stood up and looked toward the ridge. This is the second incident I know of on your property. Was there anything between the visits from Garrett's men and now? She told him about the third visit, the one with the look in the man's eyes, and described the man as specifically as she could, and Covington listened with a particular focus that told her this matched something he already knew. "His name is Decker," Covington said. "He's done this kind of work for Garrett in Comanche County and in the territory north of Abilene. He doesn't make empty statements." He looked at her directly. "Miss Winslow, I need to be honest with you. The situation here is moving toward a confrontation. The legal work I'm doing through the association will take weeks. The pattern of Garrett's activities needs to be documented in a way that the district court will accept, and that takes time. In the meantime, Garrett is going to increase the pressure on the people he can't buy. On the people who have said no," she said. "Yes. Then the pressure will increase on me," she said, "because I have said no and I am going to continue to say no." He looked at her for a moment with that steady, measuring attention. "I know," he said. "I'm not here to tell you to sell. I'm here to tell you that I think you should not be here alone." She had been expecting something like this, some version of the suggestion that she should remove herself for her own safety, go stay with someone, make herself smaller and less present, and she had been prepared to refuse it, but he pressed on before she could speak. "I'm not suggesting you leave," he said. "I know you won't. I'm suggesting that someone should be here, another set of eyes, another rifle. I have no other urgent assignment until the legal documentation is ready for the county seat. I could sleep in your barn." She looked at him. "Your reputation will be perfectly intact," he said, with a slight dryness. "I have no designs on your person, Miss Winslow. I'm offering a practical arrangement for a situation with real physical risk." "I know you have no designs on my person," she said, though this was not entirely true in the sense that she was conscious of, and had been for some days, that she found him interesting in ways that went past the merely practical. "I also know that this is a reasonable offer, and I'm not going to refuse it on pride." "Good," he said. He went back to town to retrieve his horse and his bedroll and a few necessities, and returned in the late afternoon, and Mamie put clean straw in the barn's side room where her father had sometimes slept during calving season, and showed him where the water was, and made supper for two instead of one with the kind of mechanical matter-of-factness she used when she was trying not to think about something too directly. They ate at the table she had made and talked about the evening sounds of the land. She told him what each one meant, which animals, which weather, and he listened the way he always listened. And after supper he sat on the porch steps for a while, and she sat in the rocking chair above him, and they watched the stars come out with a companionship that felt already like something that had been built over more time than it had. In the morning she was up before dawn, as was her habit, and found him already at the fence line checking for any new disturbance, moving quietly through the gray light with the Springfield he had borrowed from the porch without asking, but with an ease that told her he had used one before. She watched him from the porch for a moment before he saw her, and she thought that there was something particular about watching a person who moves with that combination of care and capability through a place you love. He looked up and saw her and raised a hand briefly, and she went inside to start the fire and put the coffee on. Over the following days, a rhythm established itself. He took the early fence check and the north pasture. She took the south pasture and the water situation. They cooked together in the evenings with the easy, unremarkable division of labor that comes naturally to two people who are both accustomed to working alone and have discovered a comfortable way of working together. They talked, really talked, the way Mamie had not talked to anyone since her father died, the kind of conversation that covers ground and makes you think differently about things you thought you'd already thought through. He told her about the cases he had worked before this one, not the dramatic versions, but the actual ones, with their complexities and frustrations and occasional dark passages. He had seen land taken from people in ways that the law would not correct. He had seen the law be a very fine tool for people who had lawyers and money. He had seen families broken and moved and diminished, and he had also seen, sometimes, situations turned back, lines held. He spoke about justice with the tone of a man who believes in it precisely, because he has seen enough of its absence to know what its presence is worth. She told him things she had not told anyone, how frightened she had been in the first weeks after her father's death, not of living alone, which she had managed before, but of loving a piece of land with that depth of commitment and knowing how easily it could be taken. She told him about the land deed, which was in her father's name, and which she had spent 3 weeks at the county seat getting transferred to her own name, fighting through the confusion and casual dismissal of county clerks who were not accustomed to single women holding property. She told him about the particular exhaustion of being competent in a world that keeps requiring you to prove it. He listened to all of this without filling in the silences with reassurances or advice, and then he said, "It takes more energy to be constantly dismissed than it does to be constantly tested. Dismissal doesn't give you a chance to prove anything. It just moves the wall back." "That's exactly right," she said, and was surprised by how simple it felt to say it to someone who understood. On the 5th day of his stay, Decker came back. He came in the afternoon, this time with 2 men, and he came through the gate without being invited, which told Mamie something about how the calculation had shifted in Garrett's mind. She was at the well when she heard the horses, and she turned around with the water bucket in her hand and looked at them coming up the road toward the house. Covington stepped out of the barn. The moment he appeared, all 3 men's horses shifted. It was not obvious and it was not dramatic, just the small adjustments of horses that sense a change in the attention of the men riding them. But Mamie noticed it, and she put the bucket down slowly and moved her hand toward the Springfield, which was leaning against the well post. Decker was a large man, heavier than Covington, with a face that wore calculation the way some men wore expression. He looked at Covington for a long, measuring moment, and then at Mamie and then back at Covington. "Didn't realize Miss Winslow had company," Decker said. "Miss Winslow has a visitor," Covington said pleasantly. "And I believe you're on her property without an invitation. What's the business?" Decker shifted in his saddle. "We're here to make a final offer on behalf of Mr. Garrett. The price has gone up 20% from the last conversation, given the circumstances." He didn't look at the fence line, but they all knew what the circumstances referred to. Mamie picked up the Springfield, not raising it, just holding it, which was its own kind of statement. "The answer is the same as it's been," she said. "No." Decker looked at her for a long moment and then at Covington, who was standing with his arms loose at his sides and his attention complete and unhurried. Whatever Decker saw in that picture, he made a calculation. "Mr. Garrett will be disappointed," he said. "Mr. Garrett will survive it," Mamie said. Decker turned his horse and the 2 men with him turned theirs, and they rode back out through the gate. Mamie watched until they were over the first rise, and then she lowered the rifle and let out a slow breath. Covington came to stand beside her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the afternoon heat, the steadiness of his presence. "That buys us time," he said. "Not indefinitely." "I know," she said. They stood together watching the empty road for a moment, and then she said, with the sideways accuracy that was her natural mode of speaking things she meant, "I'm glad you were here." He turned to look at her, and the look was different from the ones before, still direct, still without embellishment, but there was something in it that had moved closer to the surface. "So am I," he said. She looked back at the road rather than at him, because looking at him when he said things like that with that expression required a kind of steadiness she was still assembling. The legal work Covington was building moved forward through the middle of August. He had been in regular correspondence with the Cattlemen's Association in San Antonio, and there were also letters going to the district court in the county seat. And there was a lawyer named Aldridge who had been engaged by the association and was coming down from Abilene to review the land records and Garrett's methods, and the accumulated evidence of what had happened to the people who had tried to hold their ground. Covington had also been talking to people in town, not in the way of a man conducting official interviews, but in the easy, attentive way that came naturally to him, asking questions that opened into other questions, following threads that led to other threads, and building slowly a picture of everything Garrett had done in Dusty Creek and the surrounding area over the past 2 years. He talked to Alina Ruiz and her father, who had come from a family that had held land in this part of Texas since 1834, and who were being told that a deed written under Mexican land law might not be valid under American land law, which was the kind of legal argument that could only prosper in a system that wanted it to. He talked to Pete Haverson, who was living with his son now after the barn burned and would not go back. He talked to a half-dozen other families who had sold under various degrees of pressure. In the evenings, he and Mamie sat on the porch, and he told her what he was finding and what he was building, not because she was required to know, but because he seemed genuinely interested in her thinking on it. She had a clarity of analysis that he found valuable. She could see the shape of a situation quickly and identify the weak point without getting lost in details. and she found herself engaged with the legal and strategic questions in a way that reminded her of how much she had always wanted a problem that was worth solving. "The Ruiz deed is the most important piece," she said one evening. "The stars enormous, and closed the way they were in August in West Texas. If you can establish that the Mexican land grant is valid, and it is, historically and legally, then you've established a precedent that makes Garrett's method of challenging those grants worthless. Without that method, half his acquisitions don't hold." He was quiet for a moment. Aldridge said exactly that, word for word. "Then Aldridge is correct," she said. "He is," Covington agreed. "He's also worried about the timing. The land transfers are being pushed through the county records faster than they should be, which suggests Garrett has either paid someone in the recorder's office or is planning to move before the legal challenge can land. Can you stop the recording? We can file a challenge that puts the transfers in dispute. That requires Aldridge to be here with the documentation, which should be 2 weeks. 2 weeks is a long time," she said. "It is," he agreed. She looked at the stars for a moment. "What happens to you after this? After the case is done and Garrett is stopped?" The question came out more directly than she had intended, and she heard the edge of something in it that was not strictly about the case, and she thought he heard it too, because there was a brief pause before he answered. "The association will send me somewhere else," he said. "There's always another situation. Is that what you want, to always go somewhere else?" Other pause. He was looking at the stars too, or at the middle distance that lay between looking at the stars and looking at nothing, and his hands were loosely linked together on his knees. "I'm not sure I've thought about what I want in that way for a while," he said, with an honesty that was slightly careful, the honesty of a man testing the weight of something before he puts it down. "I've been good at the work. The work has needed doing, that's been sufficient." "Has been," she said. "Has been," he repeated quietly. They sat with that for a while in the warm night, and the coyotes called from the far ridge and Cora moved in the paddock, and somewhere a nightjar was doing its repetitive mechanical calling, and the easiness between them was made of all those things at once and was, Mamie thought, about as close to contentment as she had come since before her father got sick. "My father told me once," she said, "that the land doesn't ask anything of you except your attention. That if you pay attention to it, really pay attention, not just use it, it gives you something that can't be named but that you'll miss terribly if you lose it." "He was right," Covington said, and his voice had the texture of a man who has been away from something he didn't know he missed. "You know the feeling," she said. "It was not a question. I grew up on a farm," he said. "Before the war changed everything, before I started moving. I know what your father meant." She turned to look at him then, and he turned to look at her. And in the long moment that followed, all the practical considerations and careful distances fell away, and what remained was simply two people in honest recognition of one another, which is one of the rarest things there is. "I would not be unhappy," she said very clearly, "if the somewhere else you go next turned out to be here." He held her gaze for a long moment, and then something settled in his face, the last careful distance resolving into something open and direct and entirely unguarded. "Mamie," he said, and her name in his mouth was a different thing from what it was in anyone else's. "I've been trying very hard to maintain a professional consideration of this situation." "I noticed," she said. "And failing at it for at least a week," he said. "I noticed that too," she said. He reached across the small space between them on the porch steps and took her hand, and his hand was large and rough and warm, and she turned her hand to hold his, and they sat like that in the August dark with the stars enormous above them and the land breathing all around them. And Mamie thought that this was what it felt like when a thing that had been growing in the dark finally broke the surface. They did not rush what came after. Neither of them was built for rushing, and both of them understood that what was between them was worth the time it deserved. There was a kiss at the end of that evening, brief and quiet and certain, like a fact being confirmed rather than a question being asked. And then he went to the barn and she went to the house, and she lay awake for a while smiling in the dark in the unsophisticated and excellent way of a person who has been given an unexpected and very welcome gift. The next 2 weeks were the best 2 weeks Mamie could remember in recent years, which was strange because they were also 2 weeks of significant practical worry. Garrett made 2 more attempts to pressure the outlying property owners, and there was an incident at the Yellow Dog Saloon where one of Garrett's men got into a confrontation with young Diego Ruiz that ended with a broken chair and a black eye on each side, and Sheriff Terrell being required to actually do something official for the first time in recent memory. Aldridge the lawyer arrived from Abilene with a leather case full of documents and was set up in a corner of the sheriff's office to work through the records, and the whole enterprise felt like a race that was being run in 2 different registers simultaneously. The slow, careful register of legal documentation and the fast, dangerous register of what Garrett might do if he understood he was losing. Through all of it, she and Covington moved together in the way of 2 people who have found their footing with each other and are continuously surprised by how good the footing is. They worked side by side through the long, hot days, and in the evenings they talked and sometimes just sat in shared quiet, and there was a great deal of practical discussion and problem-solving, and also an increasing amount of what could only be called courtship in the most honest sense of that word, the kind that consists of 2 people discovering each other methodically and finding each discovery worth having made. He told her things about himself that she understood he did not tell easily. The years after the war, when Missouri had been a difficult place to grow up, the way the country had been divided in his community in ways that went down into families and stayed there. The loneliness of the itinerant work, which he had managed by becoming very good at solitude, and was now discovering with some surprise that he was not as suited to it as he had believed. The way he thought about the land cases he worked, not as assignments, but as something that mattered in the same way that a person's home matters, which was why he had been angry for a long time at the people who took other people's homes by force or manipulation and called it business. She told him about being a woman in a world that assessed her by categories she had never agreed to be assessed by, and about her father's gift to her of the belief that competence was competence regardless of who possessed it, and about how that belief had been tested repeatedly and had not broken but had left its marks. She told him about the loneliness too, the particular kind that comes from being seen past rather than seen wrong, from being rendered invisible by assumption before you've had a chance to exist. "I see you," he said, one evening simply. "I know," she said. "That was the first thing I noticed." In the 3rd week of August, lawyer Aldridge filed the legal challenge in the county seat court, and the challenge held the presiding judge was a careful man named Everett who had been on the bench for 20 years and was not susceptible to the kind of pressure that had worked on county clerks and other smaller officials. The Ruiz land grant was confirmed as valid. The transfers of 3 other properties that had been made under what Aldridge described as coercive and legally questionable circumstances were put under review. And Wade Garrett, faced with the prospect of a formal investigation that had both the Cattlemen's Association and now the district court behind it, made the calculation that his legal exposure was greater than his potential gain and began the process of quiet withdrawal. He did not go gracefully. There was a final aggressive visit from Decker, this time at the sheriff's office rather than at anyone's property, with the explicit message that the legal challenge would be contested, that the association had no authority in matters of private land sale, that the residents of Dusty Creek would regret the trouble they had caused. Terrell took down what Decker said with the seriousness of a man who had recently remembered what being serious was for, and sent a copy of it to Aldridge, who sent it to the court as additional evidence of pattern and method. 3 days later, Garrett left Dusty Creek. He left on a Tuesday morning, Mamie's favorite day for good things to happen, and she knew he was gone when Clara Blaine sent word by the livery boy that the hotel room was cleared and the horses were off to the livery to be sold. She was checking the east fence when she heard, standing in the long dry grass with the Springfield on her back and the sun coming straight down, and she felt the weight that had been sitting on her chest for months lift and reconstitute itself as something more like relief than she had expected. Relief, so physical, it felt almost like taking a proper breath for the first time in a long while. Covington came to find her in the pasture because he had heard the news from Aldridge, and they stood together in the grass, and she looked at the land, her land, all 40 acres of it running from the east fence to the water cut on the west, the stubborn, dry, difficult, beloved acres that had been her father's life's work and were now her own, and she felt something settle in her that was permanent and deep. He stood beside her and looked at the land with her, and after a while she turned to look at him. "So," she said. "So," he said. "You'll be writing to the association," she said. "I sent a preliminary report yesterday," he said. "The case is substantially closed. They'll want a final accounting in San Antonio." "When?" "End of the month," he said. He was looking at her with the full attention she had come to understand was the most complete honesty he was capable of. "After which I could go anywhere." "You could," she agreed. "Mamie," he said. "Samuel," she said. The first time she had used his given name the evening previous, she had watched something move in his face that she had found extraordinarily satisfying to cause. It moved again now. "I want to come back here," he said, "to Dusty Creek, to you, if that's what you want." "That is very much what I want," she said. "I want you to come back here and help me fix the south pasture fence, which needs a full day's work. And then I want you to come to supper. And then I want to sit on the porch and talk for a long time. And then I want to do that every day for the rest of my natural life." He laughed, the real laugh, not the dry amusement he deployed in general company, but a full and genuine laugh that startled two quail out of the grass 20 feet away. And he reached for her, and she stepped into his arms with the certainty of someone stepping onto ground they already know is solid. And he held her in the middle of her own pasture in the August heat and the dry, sweet grass smell, and she put her face against his shoulder and felt, fully and without reservation, that this was a good arrangement. He went to San Antonio at the end of August and was back in 12 days, which Mamie thought was a reasonable time but felt considerably longer. She spent the 12 days doing the things she always did, the fence work, the cattle, the garden, the chickens, and writing him 2 letters that she then did not send because writing them had been sufficient. She also had 3 conversations with Clara Blaine that were ostensibly about other things but were clearly about the situation, and Clara was transparent in her approval in the way of a woman who has been waiting for 2 specific people to get on with it. When he came back, he came with a proposal, which he made in the evening on the porch in the last of the golden light, and he made it with the same direct, unceremonious honesty that characterized everything he did. Told her that he had spoken to the association about a different arrangement, that there was an option for him to take a permanent regional post based out of a fixed location rather than traveling, that the location could be Dusty Creek if that worked for the case geography. Which it did because West Texas had its own ongoing land disputes that would benefit from permanent attention. "This is not a proposal made on the strength of practical convenience," he said clearly. "I want to be honest that the arrangement is genuinely convenient, but that is not why I'm proposing it." "I know," she said. "I'm proposing it because you are the most remarkable person I've encountered in 15 years of work that took me across most of this country," he said. "And because being here with you is the most at home I've felt since I was young and home was a thing I had. And because I believe we could build something together that would be worth having built." She had been watching him through all of this, and now she said, "Samuel, the answer has been yes for about 3 weeks. You didn't need to be quite so thorough." He looked at her for a moment, and then that real laugh came again, and she thought she would never tire of causing it. They were married in October, in the small Methodist church that doubled as a schoolhouse, by Pastor Hughes, who was visibly delighted, and who gave a sermon about the parable of the talents that everyone understood was specifically aimed at the assembled congregation's long-standing failure to acknowledge what was right in front of them. Clara Blaine cried. Elena Ruiz stood beside Mamie as her witness, and wore a dress the color of late roses. Covington's best man was Aldridge the lawyer, who had stayed in Dusty Creek longer than necessary because he found it interesting, which Mamie took as a mark in his favor. The reception was held at the fairground, where the church women made a feast that exhausted their combined preserves and skills, and resulted in a table of food that people talked about for the next 2 years. Young Diego Ruiz played the fiddle, and 2 of the Haverson grandchildren danced in circles until they fell down, and Sheriff Terrell made a toast that was unexpectedly heartfelt, and revealed that he had been quietly rooting for this outcome for some time. Mamie wore her mother's cameo at her throat and her own good boots, which she had polished to a brightness that was almost extravagant, and she was not, on her wedding day, a woman who had been softened or changed or transformed in the way that stories suggested women should be changed by love. She was entirely herself, the Springfield on the wall at home, the land going about its October business outside, the same directness in her eyes instead of her jaw, but alongside herself, there was now Samuel, who fit beside her in the particular way that a piece of ground fits your weight when you've stood on it enough times, and this was so much better than the alteration stories promised. The winter of 1882 and into 1883 was a working winter in the truest sense, the 2 of them together on the land, with the addition of a second pair of hands for everything that had been done by one pair before, and the difference was enormous and gratifying. They broke more ground in the spring than Mamie had been able to manage alone, and planted a larger kitchen garden. Covington took the regional post as he had arranged, which required him to travel occasionally, a week here, 10 days there, and in the gaps she ran everything herself as she always had, and when he came back there was the dual pleasure of the return and the account. Him telling her what he had found, she telling him what had happened to the land. Calhoun Briggs made one final attempt at relevance the following spring, when he organized a shooting competition, and pointedly did not include women on the list of eligible entrants. Mamie entered anyway, as a matter of simple principle, and when Briggs told her the competition was for men, Covington turned from where he was standing with a coffee cup and said pleasantly that he didn't see why a competition for the best shot in the county should arbitrarily limit its pool of participants to the half that demonstrably shot worse. Briggs sputtered. Several of the younger ranchers who had been at the fair the previous summer looked at their boots. The competition was held and Mamie entered it, and she won it by a margin that required no qualification, and the prize money, a modest $5, she spent on new cartridges, which was the only sensible use for prize money she had ever been able to identify. The summer of 1883 brought news that the proposed railroad route had been officially rerouted around the direct path through Dusty Creek, which the county greeted with the deep satisfaction of people who have collectively weathered something together and come out the other side. The Ruiz family threw a party that lasted 2 days. Old Pete Haverson came back to look at his land, which had gone to weeds and scrub in his absence, and stood there with his hands in his pockets for a long while, and then said he supposed he had better start thinking about a new barn. Mamie was expecting their first child by the time the summer heat broke into the cool of early fall. She received this news from the doctor in town with the same focused, unsentimental attention she brought to all important information, and then she rode home and told Covington in the evening on the porch, and watched his face go through several things at once, the surprise, the delight, the immediate practical concern, and then settling into the particular radiance of a man being handed something he had not known how much he wanted. He held both her hands and looked at her and said, "Are you well?" "Is everything?" The doctor said. "Everything is all right." The doctor said, "I'm healthy as a horse and considerably more sensible," she said. His words were actually somewhat less flattering, but that was the content. He laughed and she laughed, and then he pulled her close and held her, and she leaned her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, which was steady and good, and thought about the land and the seasons and the particular forward-moving shape of a life that is going in the direction you want it to go. Their son was born in the late spring of 1884, on a clear morning in May when the whole country was new and green from the April rains. He was delivered by the doctor with Clara Blaine in attendance, who had appointed herself to this position without being asked, and who turned out to be the most practically useful person in the room. Covington paced the porch in a manner that Mamie, between contractions, found both touching and faintly amusing. They named him Thomas for her father. Thomas Winslow Covington was from the beginning a child of serious attention and lively curiosity, which surprised no one who knew his parents. He learned to walk on Mamie's hard-packed floor and to run in the pasture, and to be extremely quiet when the animals required it. And by the time he was 2 years old, he was following his mother on her morning rounds with the focused, interested expression of a person who understands that what is happening is worth understanding. Covington built a second room onto the house in the summer after Thomas was born, and then a covered porch that ran the full width of the south face, which meant more room to sit in the evenings and watch the land do whatever it was doing, which remained one of their primary shared pleasures. The house that had been one woman's necessary shelter became something else, not grand. Nothing about Dusty Creek was grand, but solid and considered and full of the particular warmth of a place where people are genuinely glad to be. Elena Ruiz came to supper regularly and had become one of Mamie's best friends, the kind of friendship that involves no performance and a great deal of direct conversation about things that matter. She had begun teaching in the schoolhouse and was making considerable improvements to what had previously been a curriculum that reflected the priorities of men who did not need to imagine their daughters being educated to any great purpose. She and Mamie had long conversations about this on the covered porch, while Thomas slept, and Covington sat nearby reading one of the books he ordered from a catalog in San Antonio, occasionally adding a comment that was useful. There was a moment in the fall of 1884 when Mamie stood at the edge of the east pasture in the afternoon light, Thomas on her hip, Cora in the paddock behind her, the land running out to the ridge in its familiar colors of dry gold and dark green and the reddish earth, and she understood with a completeness that had no gap in it that this was exactly the life she had wanted. Not a version of it, not an accommodation or a compromise. The exact thing, full and present and hers. She thought about everything it had taken to get here, the years of being dismissed, the men who had looked past her skill and her sense and her knowledge of this land as if she were not the most qualified person in any room she entered. She thought about the judge who had given her prize to a man who hit 2 fewer targets. She thought about the county clerks who had made her fight for her own deed. She thought about Garrett's men cutting her fence in the dark and thinking that would be sufficient to move her. She thought about a man on a gray horse arriving in a town that needed something changed and handing her a rifle not to test her but to give the proof she had been owed for a long time. To say simply and directly, "Show them, show me. I am paying attention." She thought about the look on his face when the fence post exploded in white splinters on the ridge and how it had not been surprise, it had been confirmation. He had already understood what she was. The demonstration had been for everyone else. That, she thought, was the thing. That was the whole shape of it. A person who already saw you, looking at you clearly and saying, "I see this. Now let them." Covington came up behind her, having come from the barn where he had been repairing a saddle, and he put his hand on her shoulder and looked at the land beside her. "You're thinking," he said. "Constantly," she said. "About what in particular?" She looked at the land for another moment, and then she turned and looked at him, at the face she had come to know the way she knew the topography of her own land, every feature and expression, and the particular quality of attention it wore when it was directed at her. "About how strange and good it is," she said, "that things can go exactly right." He looked at her with that complete, unguarded expression she had come to think of as hers in the truest sense. "It's the finest thing I know of," he said. Thomas, between them, grabbed a handful of Mamie's braid with the proprietary enthusiasm of a small person who does not yet understand that other people have separate existences, and she laughed and untangled him and settled him more comfortably on her hip. And Covington took her free hand, and they stood there together in the afternoon light on the land she had held, the three of them and the sky and the long golden grass. In the spring of 1886, their daughter arrived, a red-faced and immediately opinionated person whom they named Frances, for Covington's mother, and who from the first weeks demonstrated a temperament that split the difference between her parents' varieties of stubbornness in ways that were occasionally exhausting and always fascinating. Thomas, now 2 years old, regarded his sister with the thoughtful skepticism of a person confronting an unexpected development, and gradually, over the course of several months, conceded that she was acceptable. Clara Blaine organized a welcoming party, because Clara organized everything eventually, and Dusty Creek came out in the manner of a small community that has learned to celebrate the good things vigorously, because the bad things also come vigorously. Pastor Hughes made a speech that was entirely about the joys of family and only slightly about the importance of correct doctrine. Alina Ruiz brought her pepper jelly, which was still the finest preserve produced in 3 counties, a claim that remained unchallenged. Diego Ruiz played the fiddle again, as he did at every occasion of significance. Covington's work through the regional post had achieved several important things in the 3 years he had held it. The legal framework protecting the older land grants in the area had been substantially strengthened through the ongoing work with Aldridge, who had remained involved well past the resolution of the Garrett case out of what he eventually admitted was genuine interest in the problem. 2 other attempted land acquisitions, by methods similar to Garrett's, had been interrupted early enough to prevent the displacement of the affected families. The association had expanded the regional post into a formal position with modest but reliable funding, which meant that Covington's work was both more supported and more permanent than it had been. He was, in the estimation of the people whose land had been held, a man who had done something real, which was the highest thing Mamie knew how to say about anyone. And he was, in his own estimation and in the estimation of everyone who saw them together, exactly as happy as a man had any right to expect to be, which was, in his reckoning, happier than he had believed possible during the long years of necessary solitude that had preceded this. Mamie continued to shoot. This was not remarkable in the sense that it had always been her practice, but it acquired a new dimension in those years as the reputation that had been persistently dismissed, finally, found its correct shape in the public understanding of Dusty Creek and the surrounding counties. The shooting competition at the summer fair had been integrated, in the sense that it now simply had no official exclusion, and Mamie had won it 3 years in a row with the systematic efficiency that she brought to most things she turned her attention toward. Calhoun Briggs had stopped organizing it after the 2nd year, and it had been taken over by a committee that included Alina Ruiz and Clara Blaine, and was consequently better organized than it had ever been. There was a story that circulated about the 400-yard shot at the original summer fair, about the fence post, and the Springfield and the woman who had done something the assembled crowd had then tried to explain away. And the story changed shape somewhat as stories do, growing in some tellings and simplifying in others, but the core of it remained true. She was the finest shot in 3 counties, and she had proved it, and the man who had handed her the rifle and said "prove it to me" had known, before she pulled the trigger, exactly what she was. Thomas, at 5 years old, asked to be taught to shoot, and was told he had to be old enough to hold the rifle steady without help, which was a reasonable standard that he worked toward with enormous seriousness. Francis, at 3, was more interested in Cora and the chickens and the mechanics of the water pump than in anything that required extended stillness, which suited everyone. In the long evenings of the Texas fall, when the heat finally broke and the air turned gold, and the nights were cool enough for blankets, Mamie and Covington sat on the covered porch and watched the land and talked and were quiet by turns, and the children moved in and out through the evening in the way of children who know they are in a safe place and are therefore free to range. The stars came out enormous over the flat country, the same stars her father had shown her and taught her to read, and she told them to Thomas, who listened with the focused attention he had inherited, and to Francis, who listened for exactly as long as it interested her and then asked about something entirely different, which Mamie also found entirely reasonable. She had not become someone else. This was the thing, the plain and important thing. She had not become softer or quieter or more accommodating of the dismissals that still existed, because dismissals like that do not end. They simply find you less easily. She was still the woman who would correct a man who underestimated her, still the woman who would stand at a fence line with a rifle and a clear eye and say no to the people who thought no was a temporary condition rather than a final answer. She was still the finest shot in 3 counties, and she still knew it without needing anyone else to confirm it. But she was also more than she had been alone, not more than she was capable of being, but more fully what she had always been, in the way that good company and genuine partnership allows a person to be more fully themselves rather than less. Covington had not made her something she wasn't. He had seen what she was and had said, simply and clearly, "Prove it to me," and in doing so had given her the first public moment in which her ability had been treated as a fact to be demonstrated rather than a claim to be doubted. That had been enough. Everything else had followed from that. The land held. The fence lines held. The family built itself over the years with the slow and satisfying process of things that are being done carefully. Thomas growing into a boy who could stand at a fence line and talk knowledgeably about grass and weather and the politics of water rights. Frances growing into a girl who had opinions about everything and the vocabulary to express them with exhausting precision. Both of them native to a piece of land that would be theirs after their parents and that carried, in its 40 acres of dry West Texas ground, the weight of everything that had been done to hold it. Covington made one final report to the Cattlemen's Association in the fall of 1886, documenting the 4 years of regional work, and the response from San Antonio was appreciative and offered him an expanded role that would require more travel and more central involvement in the broader land rights work across the state. He read the letter on the porch and then handed it to Mamie, who read it carefully. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "The work matters," she said. "It does," he said. "But the travel matters too," she said. He nodded. "There's a middle arrangement here," she said, with the practical directness that had always been her way. "You take the expanded role, but with the understanding that the base is here. You travel when it's required, but this is where you come back to. If they need you at the center of the work, they can put you there for a defined period, and then you come home. Do you think the association will accept that? I think you should write back and suggest it very clearly and see what they say," she said. "You've done enough for them that they should want to keep you, and the terms are entirely reasonable." He looked at her and she saw, as she often did, the thing that had been there from the beginning, the recognition, the steadiness, the warmth beneath the directness that was as real as anything else about him. "All right," he said. "I'll write it exactly that way." The association accepted the terms. This was not surprising, as Mamie had correctly assessed that they wanted to keep him and that the terms were reasonable, and because Samuel Covington was not a man who asked for things he didn't think he could get. So the years continued in the shape they had taken, the land, the work, the children, the seasons of West Texas moving through their cycles of heat and cold and wet and dry. He traveled when the work required it, sometimes for 2 weeks, sometimes for a month, And the land and the children and the daily management of everything were in Mamie's capable and entirely sufficient hands. And when he came back, there was the particular warm rightness of return that never became ordinary. They sat on the porch on a December evening in 1887, the last of the fall light making everything golden, Thomas inside doing the reading assignments Alina set him, Francis asleep after a day of tremendous activity, and Mamie said, looking at the land in its winter colors, "My father would have liked you." "I hope so," Covington said. "He would have," she said with certainty. "He would have liked that you were the first man who handed me a rifle and meant it. He would have thought it was overdue," Covington said. "Extremely overdue," she agreed. "But he would have liked that you did it." She looked at the land and then at him, and he was already looking at her, the way he often was, with that expression she had first struggled to categorize and now understood completely, the complete, uncomplicated attention of a man looking at the person who is most themselves in all the world to him. "I love this place," she said. "I love this place," he said. "And I love you," she said. "And I love you," he said, with the full and unreserved conviction of a man who has been given more than he deserves and intends to be worthy of it every day for the rest of his life. She looked at him for a moment. "That is an extremely complete declaration." "I felt the situation warranted it," he said. She leaned against him on the porch bench, his arm coming around her with the easy familiarity of years, and they watched the light leave the sky over 40 acres of West Texas earth that had been held and would be held, that had been fought for with law and paper, and the plain refusal to yield. That was home in the deepest possible sense of that word. The stars came out, one at a time and then all at once. The coyotes called from the far ridge. The land breathed in its patient, constant way. And Mamie Winslow, who had been the finest shot in 3 counties her whole life, and had spent most of that life watching men refuse to acknowledge it, sat in the December dark on the porch of her own house on her own land with her husband's arm around her, and her children breathing inside, and the Springfield rifle on the wall where it belonged. And she was content in the most complete and absolute sense of that word, not because the world had stopped requiring things of her, because it hadn't and it never would, but because she had been seen, clearly and truly, and had built from that seeing something that would last. The night settled around them, deep and full of stars, and the land lay quiet under it, and the life they had made together continued forward into all the good and ordinary days that waited ahead.